the Unholy Alliance between the Vatican, the United Nations, and George Soros. And one of the things that I want to share with you is, as I go through these slides, I'm going to show you all the people that are George Soros's acolytes, operatives, in fact, his brain trust, are there embedded at the Vatican. Without a doubt, I recognized a number of troubling facts. As Michael Hitchborn of Lepanto and LifeSite News has demonstrated, the Sustainable Development Goals are the abortion contraceptive goals of the UN based on a faulty premise that man is causing global warming. Language and lies are their weapons. When the words global warming all of a sudden started being debunked, the language morphed into climate change, as if climate doesn't change. And when climate change began to be debunked in the scientific community, that morphed into sustainable development. Sounds lofty, doesn't it? Who could be against sustainable development? Which has now morphed into, and after Hurricane Matthew, that's morphed into extreme weather. So if you listen to the language of the left, I mean, as all of you folks know, choice, all the language that they choose, it's focus grouped, it's used to lure people into passivity and complacency, and to assume that their goals are lofty. Any extreme weather, I mean, you listen to your news, any extreme weather is now blamed on climate change caused by too many people on the planet. Climate change is based on faulty science and was manufactured as a justification, a ruse to impose population control on the world. Human beings create carbon dioxide, they argue, which is creating global warming. So we must reduce carbon dioxide. Therefore, the population of man must be drastically reduced. Yet carbon dioxide is the gas of life. It makes our trees green, our plants grow. And so what's really going on here with the UN? What's really going on? Well, the great MIT atmospheric scientist and physicist stated, and I think this is a great explanation of what the climate change movement is. Controlling carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. Controlling carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. And if you read Laudato Si, if you struggle through the exhortation, you will see that much of the language just mirrors what the UN and the left global warming agenda is promoting. The environmental movement is all about power and control over our lives, down to the very electric smart meter that's attached to your home. In the Vatican conferences, they continue to blame the real crises in the world on climate change. What really caught my attention and when I decided I can't ignore this anymore is on the Vatican website. There was a statement by Bishop Sarando. There is a nexus, a close connection between climate change and human trafficking. That's when I went, there is not even a recognition anymore of evil. Blaming climate change on a real tragic crisis. They're using a phony crisis like climate change and trying to bootstrap it to a real crisis. And they do this time and time again. After decades of the Vatican really stood as a firewall against the UN and its radical population control agenda. In fact, the very people who were battling in Beijing against the Vatican representatives are the very people now that are talking at the Vatican as their experts. That's when a handful of us began protesting, writing, and exposing the radical and dangerous and preposterous unholy lines between the Vatican and the UN and the Obama administration. Gradually, I began to see another even more disturbing pattern emerge. My research uncovered that George Soros and his operatives infiltrated the Vatican and were given free rein to direct the Vatican's global warming environmental agenda and orchestrating the Vatican's exhortation on the environment. The Vatican agenda mimicked the UN eco agenda. These experts weren't merely passing acquaintances of George Soros. These individuals who were embedded in the Vatican were members of his closest advisory panels, his collaborators, and his brain trusts. My son likes to Photoshop pictures for me, but that I think after today's talk, you may share that view. Okay. This is the Pontifical Academy. It sits on the Vatican grounds. There it is, a 15th and 14th century beautiful a palace. And inside, that's where all the conferences were held. Just so you have a sense, the Vatican Gardens are right beyond there. Mission control. This is Archbishop Sarando, the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy from Argentina. He's fond of saying the UN is not the devil, quite the opposite. Well, then, if quite the opposite, then the UN must be good, I guess. And this is inside the Pontifical Academy. There's Pope Francis speaking. Sarando is right next to Pope Francis, and right next to Sarando is Jeffrey Sachs. This is the Soros Brain Trust. These two men, Jeffrey Sachs and Joe Stiglitz. Joe Stiglitz is a member, longtime member of the Pontifical Academy. He's an economist. He has written a number of books, as you will see, with George Soros. I think he's a lifetime member, if I'm not mistaken, of the Pontifical Academy. He even won a Nobel laureate prize in economics. He's, I think, affiliated with Columbia University, and he is the founding member of the International Socialist Conference, which also is funded by George Soros. The man on the end is Jeffrey Sachs. I don't think there's anybody who watches MSNBC in the room, but if you do, when Jeff Sachs is in town in New York, he's often on MSNBC, expounding on a number of issues. Jeff Sachs also was the economic advisor to Bernie Sanders, hence the invitation to Bernie Sanders. Jeff Sachs goes back, I think, 35 years with George Soros. Jeff Sachs, as a young economist from Harvard, was dispatched by George Soros to the USSR, the Soviet Union, Poland, Bolivia, when they all had struggling economies, when the USSR was falling. Jeff Sachs was one of the economists who was brought in to help get the economy back on its feet. In Russia, he failed miserably. I read something where Sachs is not even allowed to come to Russia anymore. But nevertheless, he and Soros are very close collaborators. Soros funds a number of Jeffrey Sachs initiatives at the UN to the tune of $50 million. And Jeff Sachs, Jeff Sachs, there you see the triumvirate of Soros, Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General. To me, it was very interesting to see what was really happening as I read news accounts of Jeff Sachs, as I read leaked documents in WikiLeaks. The left, the environmental left, had this united chorus that we have finally found our moral voice that we were looking for in the environmental movement. They were clearly quite aware of the successful accomplishment in getting Francis to buy into the UN environmental agenda. Ban Ki-moon came to the Vatican several times in the early part of Francis's papacy while all this discussion about the UN agenda was going on.